Hello, everyone. Happy fall. It finally does not feel like summer anymore. So, hopefully, in the midst of a busy time, you have had maybe the opportunity to be outside for a little bit. I wanted to touch base on a couple of things for our case study from this week on gifted education programming and introduce you to the assignment for this coming week. First of all, you guys are doing really well with the discussion board posts. I've enjoyed seeing how thorough you have been with your responses, and it's very clear that you're taking the assignment seriously, so I appreciate that. It makes me excited to see you turning from the point of just learning new content to starting to apply it and beginning to take that role of an advocate for gifted learners, which is especially important for this week's assignment as I'm asking you to analyze your own gifted education program or one that you are highly familiar with. But before we talk about that, let's go over some of your discussion about Mr. Draper. The majority of you did a really good job analyzing the strengths and areas of improvement for this study, or rather this program. And I wanted to highlight just some strengths and also some areas of improvement that really you guys said. So I'm just going to recap and point out a couple of different issues to start getting us thinking about our next module that will start next week. But let's start with strengths. So the majority of you mentioned that this is definitely not just one service, that this is a continuum of services for gifted students, which, as we have read in the literature, is definitely important. As Lexi even wrote in her post, that this program actually caters to both the gifted and the non-gifted. So if you think about students in that level 1, services for all students, even if you're not officially identified as gifted, having these types of opportunities are still helpful. So it's really important that we are explicit with the fact that this is a continuum of services. That helps a lot with identification issues. If you have not encountered any tough social situations with this yet, I can assure you that you will. For just a personal example, I remember being in 3rd grade, and I don't know what the identification procedures for gifted were at that time, but I do know that I missed being identified as gifted by 1/10 of a point. And it still really affected me socially in terms of like my academic self-efficacy. And I can remember just thinking, well, I wasn't gifted because I didn't participate in the pull-out gifted services. And it's really important when we talk about gifted services that we don't just say there's one opportunity and it's this one pull-out, and therefore you're either gifted or you're not. So providing a continuum of services is important, both to kind of serve those students who are on the edge and also continue to provide them with the appropriate challenge that they need. And also it's promoting that sense of we're always growing, we're always improving, and it's not either gifted or not. Having a continuum of services is definitely, as the research shows, one of the most effective ways of serving the gifted. So I was happy to see several of you all mention that. Another opportunity that I noticed that Kayla pointed this out, that we have the opportunity to develop strengths and interests in level 1, and this is a good opportunity to connect students to building an identity. I thought that was pretty wise of Kayla to mention that, because when we're providing students with the opportunity to explore their interests, what we're doing is we're promoting that intrinsic or internal motivation. So I think it's important that we have these variety of services and not just one program or one opportunity for the gifted. Another major strength was the alignment. So Mr. Draper is being very careful to provide his definition of gifted, his goals, and he even has a committee in place. And this is showing that he wants to make sure that his services are aligned with his goals and with his definition. So a lot of you mentioned the fact that we start off with this definition. Allison said that Mr. Draper gave us this clear definition and also even started to talk about characteristics of the gifted. Honestly, her post made me think a little bit because we're starting off with a definition of the gifted, but is that enough? Because we know there's all these stereotypical assumptions about what it means to be gifted. And I started to think, well, maybe beyond just a definition, we should also be providing a list of common characteristics. So I thought that was interesting from Allison. Another strength beyond that continuum of services and also the alignment part. Cindy mentioned that there is a variety of services that were accessible to many. So it's important that we provide services that are not just tailored to one type of giftedness. So as I've mentioned kind of from day one, we don't want to have these broad definitions of giftedness and then only serve in terms of here's some accelerated classes for math. So Cindy did a good job pointing out that variety. And several of you also mentioned the importance of having a committee. It is unfortunately kind of rare to have a review committee like this, and I like the fact that Mr. Draper is realizing that he cannot do this job alone. So it's important that he has methods in place to hold him in check and to make sure that what he's saying he wants to do, he's actually carrying this out. So just to recap, I would say the main strengths are definitely a continuum of services, definitely a variety of services that are provided, also promoting that alignment between the definition of giftedness and the goals and the services provided, and having a committee in place to be sure this is all working. So this committee piece leads really well into an area that I think needs to be improved, and I was happy to see that several of you mentioned this. Eliza wrote in her post, there was no mention of assessments in this program. So it's kind of a classic example of here's this really beautiful program, but wait, how do we know if it's actually working? So I appreciated seeing several of you guys mention that. Drew even went as far to say we don't know much about how well these services are working, so one of the best things that Mr. Draper could do is to begin gathering data. So it is important to be able to assess, are we actually doing what we think we're doing? Are we actually providing these services, or are we just saying we're doing everything but we're not actually carrying it out? So I was happy to see several of you mention the lack of an evaluation piece. The majority of you also mentioned the lack of teacher training, which is so important because it doesn't matter how wonderful the program is. If we don't have properly trained teachers, how are they going to deliver these services in order to meet the unique needs of our students and also the unique strengths? I think that I just finished teaching my first section of 202, which is an undergraduate course about teaching students with exceptionalities or students who are identified as gifted in the regular education classroom. So on Thursday, in the midst of the hurricane, we had our first class and we got into this discussion of, well, if you're not receiving gifted endorsement training, so your goal right now is to be a regular education teacher, your goal right now is to be a fourth grade teacher. So I just posed this to them. I said, well, if you're not going to be the pull-out gifted teacher, then why do you have to take this course on serving the gifted? And we had a really interesting conversation, and basically what we came to is if you look at identification procedures, there is universal screening for identification into gifted services at the end of grade 2. But after that, you have to be referred to be screened. So who is referring students to be screened for gifted services? The regular education teachers. So your typical fourth grade teacher, your sixth grade teacher, who is able to look at these students and say, wait a second, they seem different. I want to refer them to be tested for gifted services. And therefore, it is so important that all teachers have some form of basic training about gifted education, because they really are the gatekeepers into gifted education services. So there are some students that have those really high aptitude scores and they are automatically placed in gifted, but there are others who are not going to get that automatic identification, and they really depend on good quality teachers who can refer them for screening and refer them to test into those services. That's especially important given our next module on the invisible gifted. So we'll look at special populations and consider what is it like to be gifted but an English language learner. What is it like to be a student from a minority group who is in a gifted education program? And you'll see in this next module there is an obscene amount of underrepresentation in gifted education. Unfortunately, a lot of that is due to the fact that we as educators, we're just nominating individuals who fit our stereotype to be gifted, to be identified for these services. So it really is important that we are promoting teacher professional development, because they are the gatekeepers into these gifted education services. So I was really pleased to see several of you all mention that. I know Christy mentioned it very clearly, that there is no initiative to train the teachers. So I thought that was important, and I wanted to just highlight that it will be even more important when we consider those special populations of students. Another interesting factor that I think it was Kylie brought up is there was very little mention of parental involvement, which does somewhat surprise me considering Mr. Draper's population. So it says in the case study that the parents are advocating really fiercely. So since I saw that, I would think maybe there's some mention of parents. That's going down a whole other path, and we'll look more into that in terms of the invisible gifted, that sometimes parents don't have the ability to advocate for their students. That doesn't mean they don't have the desire. It just means maybe they're working 3 jobs and they can't come to the PTA meeting. Or maybe they speak another language and they don't know how to express themselves in English to advocate for their child. So the issue of parental involvement is a little tricky. It is highly important because the parent sees the student outside of an academic context. And remember, giftedness doesn't turn on and off at school. It's going to, roll out into the playground and to your Girl Scout meeting and to your church and everything you do. So it is important to definitely work with parents, but that brings up an interesting issue when we think about different populations for sure. Let's see. So we have identification. Another one. Not as many of you all mentioned this because we do have a definition of giftedness in here, but if you go back and review the case study, he doesn't really go into detail about how students are identified for these services. So as a consultant, I would definitely want to know, well, how are you identifying? Which measures are you using? There's a lot of issues with test bias, assessment bias. Are you using multiple measures, multiple criteria? Are you resisting using cutoff scores? All of these things are important. So I was definitely concerned not to see much on identification. We already talked about teacher training, and several of you mentioned that, as well as some sort of parental involvement. Pam did an interesting, or made rather an interesting realization that students in the younger grades, the K2, had fewer outside opportunities, which is true, which is somewhat concerning because we've talked about the importance of providing all of those different learning environments that challenge students so they are able to manifest their giftedness. And that point just really drilled home to me again, man, we've got to be appropriately training these teachers, because if we don't have as many outside opportunities for the younger kids, even more responsibility falls on the general education classroom teacher to be providing differentiated classroom activities so these students can be challenged. So I thought Pam did a good job making that realization. And a couple of you also mentioned the social emotional needs of the gifted students. I believe, who was it? Crystal. Crystal mentioned that we should be providing counseling for these students, which is definitely true. So if you look at the services, they're definitely focused on the acceleration and some enrichment. I'm not seeing much in terms of social emotional services. So I was happy to see Crystal suggest that there needs to be at least some component about the social and emotional needs. She suggested providing counseling for those students. So just to recap, in terms of areas for improvement, definitely identification. I'd like to see a more clear even diagram of how these students are identified and how that identification process matches or aligns to the gifted definition. I'd also definitely want to see more professional development in this piece, particularly geared toward the regular education teachers, since they are those gatekeepers, and also the evaluation piece. A couple of others that you all mentioned were bringing in social emotional development and making sure that we're providing opportunities for the younger students. So, as you can see, easier said than done, right? This is, like I said last week, a pretty well-written program for the gifted. When I've actually worked on a couple of projects writing these program guides, and it's very difficult, mainly because you have to write a program that is appropriate and that is research-based, but is also realistic. So sometimes gifted education programs, they just look perfect, but they're kind of these catch-all programs. And when you think about it, if you just say that you're going to basically do everything, how does that actually carry out in the real classroom? So these gifted education program guides, like the South Carolina Manual, I've given you to read several times. It's kind of like ideal, and it's like this is what we should be doing, but then the end of the day, how does that get translated to the regular classroom? And I think it's difficult to kind of balance the line between what we know to be best practice and what we know to be reality. Particularly some of the projects I've been working with, they had very diverse environments. So I worked with Defense Education School, so we were writing gifted education programs for students who were in military schools, but their resources really differed between the military schools, like in Japan versus in other countries versus stateside. So we had to be aware of that context when writing these programs. So I think that's an important note. When you look at a gifted education program, you can't just think about it in isolation of where this education is taking place. I would rather see an honest program guide that may need some improvement but can actually be carried out than this like utopian perfect guide that actually isn't possible given the resources that we have. So you all did a wonderful job analyzing that. Thank you for looking at those NAGC standards. Those are excellent standards that you should, I said this earlier, at least bookmark on your laptop unless you want to print it out. I refer to those all of the time, so it was good to see you applying those this week. In terms of our coming week, your assignment this week is this gifted program critique. I mentioned earlier in our video that we're definitely progressing to more of the role of an advocate. So I like this assignment because it's very real world, very close to home. So in short, the assignment is to evaluate the gifted education program either in your current school where you're working, or if you're not currently working in a school environment, if you're a full-time student, then I'd like you to choose either a school that you personally went to or you've worked at before, or you have some kind of personal interest in. So, for example, I've had students complete this assignment for schools that their children were currently enrolled in. So, as it says on Blackboard, the assignment is to choose one gifted education program, again, either at your school or your child's school, and to basically do the same thing that we did this past week for the case study, but looking at this particular gifted education program. So on Blackboard, I've outlined 5 different questions I'd like you to address. The first is, how does this program define giftedness, and do you think this is an effective definition? Second, how do they identify students to receive services, and do you think these are effective identification procedures? Third, what are these services? So are they mainly acceleration? Are they mainly enrichment? Is it a mix? Is it pull-out? Is it ability grouping? Try to use as much terminology there as possible. And lastly, what are some areas that need to be improved? And what are some strengths? Again, using those NAGC standards. Now, I realize that this is a real-world assignment, and some of these gifted education programs may not cover all of these questions. In fact, that's quite common. So I do ask that as you are writing up this assignment, if you can't find the answer to one thing, then just tell me. So for example, there is often times when I grade these, students are so surprised because they can't find the precise identification procedures for their gifted programs. So they'll just say, I've searched the website, I've even asked the principal, I've asked some individuals, I still don't actually know how we identify students for these gifted services. That's fine, you can't help that, but please don't just skip the question. So tell me that you couldn't find the information. I would encourage you to look online, to talk to other individuals in your work environment who may know more about the content than you do. This is a good assignment because it gets you out in your real environment and gets you hopefully applying all of these programming standards from NAGC. So that is your challenge for the week, and I would ask that as you are investigating these gifted education programs, that you look at them with a critical eye. Particularly look at the makeup of the students in these gifted education services, just to kind of get you ready for next week when we'll cover the invisible gifted, and think about, are there certain students that may have a more slight chance of being identified under these identification procedures? Or what endeavors do we have to make sure that we are identifying students from multiple ethnic groups, multiple racial groups, different languages, even students who are twice exceptional? So again, I will be looking for those assignments to be turned in by Sunday evening. And I think that I've posed several questions on the discussion board. I have some conversation going back and forth with some of you all. So I would encourage you to also keep your eye on the discussion board throughout this week as well. As always, I'm here to help. I'm here to answer any questions you may have, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.